The morning sun cast long shadows across Ridgemont Naval Aviation Academy as Laura Martinez stepped out of the administration building, her discharge papers clutched in trembling hands. The official seal of the United States Navy seemed to mock her from the crisp white letterhead. 3 years of preparation, 2 years of training, and it was over in 15 minutes behind closed doors. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Cadet Martinez! The voice cracked like a whip across the courtyard. She turned to see Colonel James Blackwood striding toward her, his polished boots clicking against the concrete with military precision. His weathered face bore the permanent scowl of a man who'd spent 30 years breaking dreams and calling it duty. Behind him trailed Captain Stevens and Lieutenant Commander Walsh, their expressions ranging from uncomfortable to openly hostile. "Sir," Laura responded, snapping to attention despite knowing it no longer mattered. Blackwood stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell the bitter coffee on his breath and see the network of broken capillaries across his nose. His gray eyes swept her from head to toe with undisguised contempt. "I want you to understand something before you leave my academy," he began, his voice low and venomous. "This isn't about your test scores. This isn't about your flight simulator rankings. This is about reality, and the reality is that when bullets start flying and men are dying, nobody wants to worry about babysitting some girl who thinks she can play pilot." The words hit her like physical blows, but Laura kept her expression neutral. She'd heard variations of this speech before, from instructors who questioned every maneuver, from fellow cadets who treated her presence like an elaborate joke, from administrators who seemed surprised she'd made it past the front gates. "You might have fooled the recruitment board with your sob story," Blackwood continued, beginning to pace around her in a slow circle. "Young woman from the barrio, father killed in Afghanistan, mother working 3 jobs to keep the lights on. Very touching, very politically correct. But this isn't a charity case, Martinez. This is the United States Navy, and we don't have time for social experiments." Captain Stevens shifted uncomfortably behind him, but said nothing. Laura noticed his discomfort and filed it away. Not everyone here shared Blackwood's views, but they were all too cowardly to speak up when it mattered. "Your flight instructors tell me you're adequate." Blackwood said the word like it tasted bitter. "Adequate at following orders, adequate at basic maneuvers, adequate at staying out of trouble. You know what adequate gets you in combat, Martinez? It gets real pilots killed." He stopped directly in front of her again, his face inches from her. She could see the pores in his skin, the flecks of gray in his mustache, the cold calculation in his eyes. "I've been flying since before you were born, girl. I've seen combat over 3 different countries, logged more flight hours than most pilots see in their entire careers. And I'm telling you right now, you don't have what it takes. You'll never have what it takes." Laura felt something crack inside her chest, but her voice remained steady. "Sir, my scores indicate otherwise." Blackwood's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Scores? You think this is about scores? Let me tell you about scores, Martinez. Every washout who ever sat in my office had great scores. Every pilot I've had to scrape off a mountainside somewhere had scores that looked real impressive on paper." He began pacing again, his voice rising with each word. "But when the surface-to-air missiles start flying, when your wingman's been hit and is going down in flames, when you've got 30 seconds to make a decision that'll save or damn 100 Marines on the ground, your precious scores don't mean shit." The profanity echoed across the courtyard, causing a group of first-year cadets to glance over nervously. Laura could feel their stares, could sense the mixture of curiosity and pity in their young faces. She'd been their inspiration once, proof that anyone could make it if they worked hard enough. Now she's their cautionary tale. "You want to know why you're really being discharged?" Blackwood leaned in close, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow felt more threatening than his shouting. It's not because you can't fly, it's because you can't lead. And a pilot who can't lead gets people killed. Sir, I've consistently ranked in the top 5% for following orders, he exploded, spittle flying from his lips. For doing exactly what you're told, when you're told, how you're told. But command isn't about following orders, Martinez. It's about making the hard choices when there's no manual to guide you, when everything's gone to hell and people are counting on you to bring them home alive. He gestured toward the flight line, where a row of training aircraft sat gleaming in the morning sun. You see those planes? Those aren't toys. Those aren't video games. Those are weapons of war, and the people who fly them need to have ice in their veins and fire in their belly. They need to be killers when the mission demands it and saviors when their brothers are in trouble. Laura followed his gaze to the aircraft, feeling a familiar ache in her chest. She dreamed of flying those planes since she was 8 years old, watching jets streak across the sky above her neighborhood in East Los Angeles. While other kids played with dolls or video games, she'd been building model aircraft and studying aerodynamics textbooks she could barely understand. I've watched you for 2 years, Martinez, Blackwood continued, his voice taking on an almost conversational tone that was somehow more chilling than his anger. You're technically proficient. You follow procedures. You don't make waves. But you know what I've never seen from you? I've never seen you take charge when things go wrong. I've never seen you make the tough call when lives are on the line. I've never seen you show the kind of aggressive leadership that separates real pilots from people who just happen to know how to fly. The accusation stung because Laura recognized the grain of truth in it. She had always been careful, methodical, and precise. She'd learned early that as a woman and a minority in a male-dominated field, every mistake would be magnified, every success diminished. So she'd played it safe, followed every rule, dotted every I, and crossed every T. But playing it safe had apparently played right into Blackwood's narrative. This decision isn't personal, he said, though everything about his demeanor suggested otherwise. It's practical. In 6 months, some of these cadets are going to be flying real missions over real enemy territory. The man or woman in the cockpit next to them needs to be someone they can trust with their lives, someone who'll make the hard choices, someone who'll take risks when the mission demands it. He paused, letting the words sink in before delivering his final verdict. You're not that person. You'll never be that person. And I won't have the blood of real warriors on my hands just because some bureaucrats in Washington think diversity is more important than capability. The silence that followed was deafening. Laura could hear the distant sound of aircraft engines from the practice field, the rustle of palm fronds in the California breeze, the steady tick of her own heartbeat in her ears. Around them, the academy continued its daily routine. Cadets hurrying to classes, instructors reviewing flight plans, ground crews servicing aircraft. Life was moving on without her. Do you have anything to say for yourself, Martinez? Blackwood asked, his tone suggesting he hoped she didn't. Laura looked at him for a long moment, studying the face of the man who just destroyed 3 years of her life with a 15-minute meeting and a signature on official letterhead. She thought about the things she could say, about the nights she'd stayed up studying while her classmates partied, about the extra flight hours she'd logged on her own dime, about the moment she'd decided to dedicate her life to serving her country. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Mija, he'd said in his careful English, still heavily accented after 2 decades in the States, those pilots up there, they started just like you, just kids with big dreams. The only difference is they never let anyone tell them those dreams were too big. That night, Laura had announced to her parents that she was going to be a fighter pilot. Her mother, Carmen, had smiled and ruffled her hair, treating it like the kind of phase all children go through. But Eduardo had taken her seriously. He'd bought her books about aviation, model planes to build, even an old flight simulator program for their ancient computer. When other fathers were teaching their sons to throw footballs or change oil, Eduardo Martinez was teaching his daughter the principles of lift and thrust, the importance of situational awareness, the difference between a barrel roll and an aileron roll. The foundation of Laura's aviation knowledge hadn't come from expensive flight schools or elite academies. It had come from a working-class father who understood that dreams required more than just wishing. They required preparation. By the time Laura entered high school, she was already taking advanced mathematics and physics courses, knowing she'd need them for an aeronautical engineering degree. She joined the Civil Air Patrol, volunteering for search and rescue missions on weekends. She'd learned to fly single-engine Cessnas at a small municipal airport, paying for lessons with money earned from a part-time job at a local auto parts store. Her grades were perfect, not because learning came easily, but because she understood that for someone like her, a Latina from a working-class family with no military connections, perfect wasn't good enough. Perfect was the bare minimum. She needed to be exceptional. The plan had been simple and methodical. Graduate valedictorian from high school, earn an aeronautical engineering degree from UCLA on an ROTC scholarship, complete flight training, and begin her career as a naval aviator. It was a 15-year plan that required every piece to fall perfectly into place. Then, during her junior year at UCLA, everything fell apart. Eduardo Martinez had been driving home from his job at a defense contractor when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into his pickup truck at 60 miles per hour. He'd been killed instantly, according to the police report. The other driver, a wealthy businessman from Beverly Hills, had walked away with minor injuries and an expensive lawyer who would ensure he served less than 2 years in minimum security prison. Laura had been in the middle of finals week when she got the call. She'd driven straight home to find her mother collapsed on the living room floor, surrounded by sympathy cards and casserole dishes from neighbors who meant well but couldn't possibly understand the magnitude of what had been lost. Carmen Martinez hadn't just lost her husband. She'd lost the family's primary income, their health insurance, and their anchor in a country where she'd never quite learned to navigate alone. For 2 weeks, Laura had seriously considered dropping out of school to take care of her family. Her ROTC scholarship was conditional on maintaining full-time student status, but her mother was drowning in medical bills and funeral costs. Miguel was only 14, still in middle school, and someone needed to make sure he stayed focused on his education instead of making the kinds of mistakes that could derail his future. It was Carmen who'd ultimately made the decision for her. "Your father didn't spend 20 years teaching you to fly so you could work at the grocery store," she'd said, her English more heavily accented in moments of stress. "You finish school. You become a pilot. You make him proud. The rest, we figure out." So Laura had stayed in school, but she'd also taken on the responsibility of managing her family's finances, helping Miguel with his homework via video calls, and sending home every spare dollar from her part-time jobs. She'd graduated summa cum laude, but the celebration had been muted. Eduardo wasn't there to see her commission as a second lieutenant in the Navy. He wasn't there to watch her earn her wings. He wasn't there to offer advice when the pressure at flight school became overwhelming. What Colonel Blackwood had interpreted as a lack of leadership wasn't timidity. It was the careful deliberation of someone who understood that failure meant more than just personal disappointment. Laura carried the weight of her entire family's sacrifices, her father's dreams, and her community's expectations. Every decision had to be measured against those responsibilities. But there had been moments when that careful approach had proven itself. During her second year at Richmond, she'd been assigned to a training exercise involving night navigation over the Pacific. Her flight instructor, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Hayes, had deliberately introduced equipment failures to test the cadets' ability to adapt under pressure. While other cadets had panicked or made rash decisions, Laura had methodically worked through the emergency checklist, identified alternative navigation methods, and safely brought her aircraft back to base. Hayes had written in Laura's evaluation, "Cadet Martinez demonstrates exceptional composure under pressure and sound decision-making skills. Her technical knowledge is superior, and her flying ability is among the best in her class. She may not be the loudest voice in the briefing room, but she's often the most thoughtful." Those evaluations told a different story than the one Blackwood had presented during her discharge meeting. Laura's file was full of commendations for her flying skills, her technical knowledge, and her reliability. Instructors praised her precision, her safety record, and her ability to help struggling classmates improve their own performance. The disconnect between her actual record and Blackwood's assessment wasn't lost on Laura. She'd noticed how his criticism always seemed to focus on subjective qualities, leadership, aggressiveness, the mysterious it factor that supposedly separated real pilots from pretenders. Meanwhile, her objective performance metrics were consistently excellent. She'd also noticed how Blackwood's definitions of leadership seemed to correlate strongly with being male, preferably white, and coming from a military family. Cadets who fit that profile were praised for their natural command presence even when their flying skills were mediocre. Cadets like Laura, women, minorities, first-generation military, were held to different standards, expected to prove themselves over and over again in ways their peers never had to. The bus pulled into the downtown Los Angeles terminal as evening shadows stretched across the city. Laura gathered her duffel bag and walked through the familiar streets of her childhood, noting how much had changed in the years she'd been away. Gentrification had crept into Boyle Heights, bringing trendy coffee shops and expensive lofts that longtime residents couldn't afford. The neighborhood was caught between its working-class roots and an uncertain future, much like Laura herself. Her mother's apartment looked exactly the same, small, tidy, filled with pictures of Eduardo in his Air Force uniform and Laura in her navy dress blues. Carmen Martinez was in the kitchen when Laura walked in, and the older woman's face immediately registered that something was wrong. "Mija," she said softly, setting down the dish towel she'd been holding, "what happened?" Laura had rehearsed this conversation during the bus ride, but all her carefully prepared explanations evaporated when she saw her mother's concerned expression. Instead, she simply said, "They discharged me." Carmen's face went through several emotions, confusion, anger, protective fury, before settling on something that looked like grim determination. She moved to the stove and began preparing coffee, a ritual that had marked every important conversation in the Martinez household for as long as Laura could remember. "Tell me," Carmen said simply. So Laura told her about Blackwood's accusations, about the closed-door meeting that had lasted 15 minutes, about the discharge papers that had effectively ended her military career before it had properly begun. She explained the official reasoning, failure to demonstrate leadership potential, and the unofficial message that had been delivered with considerably more venom. Carmen listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When Laura finished, her mother was quiet for several minutes, staring into her coffee cup as if searching for answers in the dark liquid. "Your father," Carmen finally said, "he used to tell me stories about men like this, Colonel. Men who thought the military belonged only to people who looked like them, who came from the same places they came from. He said the hardest part of his job wasn't maintaining the aircraft, it was proving every day that he deserved to be there." She looked up at Laura, her dark eyes fierce with an emotion that hadn't dimmed in the 3 years since Eduardo's death. "But he also told me something else. He said the best revenge against people like that isn't anger or bitterness. It's excellent. It's proving them wrong so completely that they can never doubt you again." Laura felt something stir in her chest. Not quite hope, but not quite despair either. "Mom, my military career is over. Blackwood made sure of that. There's no appeal process for this kind of discharge. I can't just walk into another service branch and start over." "Who said anything about the military?" Carmen asked, raising an eyebrow. "Your father taught you to fly because he believed you belonged in the sky. He never said it had to be in a uniform." That night, Laura sat in her childhood bedroom surrounded by aviation textbooks and model airplanes, considering possibilities she'd never allowed herself to explore. She'd been so focused on the military path that she'd never seriously considered alternatives. But her mother was right. Her father had taught her to love flying itself, not just military flying. That night, Laura sat in her childhood bedroom surrounded by aviation textbooks and model airplanes, considering possibilities she'd never allowed herself to explore. She'd been so focused on the military path that she'd never seriously considered alternatives. But her mother was right. Her father had taught her to love flying itself, not just military flying. She pulled out her laptop and began researching civilian aviation opportunities. Commercial airlines were always looking for qualified pilots, especially those with military training, even incomplete military training. Corporate aviation, cargo companies, flight instruction, test pilot programs, there were dozens of paths that could keep her in the cockpit. More importantly, she realized that her discharge from Ridgemont didn't erase everything she'd learned there. She still had her aeronautical engineering degree, her commercial pilot's license, and nearly 2 years of advanced flight training. She had the technical knowledge, the flying skills, and the work ethic. What she didn't have was the narrow-minded gatekeeping that had defined her military experience. For the first time since walking out of Blackwood's office, Laura began to feel something that might have been optimism. Her story wasn't over. It was just taking a different direction than she'd planned. She had no way of knowing that in less than 6 months, that different direction would lead her back into the military's orbit in ways she could never have imagined. She couldn't foresee the crisis that would make Colonel Blackwood's ideas about leadership and combat readiness seem like the antiquated prejudices they'd always been. All she knew was that her father had been right about one thing. In America, anyone could fly if they wanted it badly enough. The only difference was that now Laura understood she didn't need anyone's permission to prove she belonged in the sky. She fell asleep that night with her father's voice echoing in her memory. "Mija, those dreams of yours aren't too big. The only thing that's too small is other people's imagination." 6 months after her discharge from Ridgemont, Laura Martinez was living a double life that would have impressed any undercover operative. By day, she worked as a flight instructor at Riverside Municipal Airport, teaching weekend warriors and aspiring commercial pilots the fundamentals of aviation in aging Cessna 172s. By night, she was something else entirely, something that would have given Colonel Blackwood nightmares if he'd known about it. The transformation had begun 3 weeks after her return to Los Angeles, when she'd received an unexpected phone call from Marcus Chen, a former classmate from UCLA's engineering program. Marcus had gone into aerospace contracting instead of military service, and his company, Apex Dynamics, had landed a lucrative contract developing next-generation flight simulation systems for the Department of Defense. "Laura, I need someone with your background," Marcus had said during their meeting at a coffee shop in Pasadena. "Someone who understands both the engineering side and the actual flying side. The military pilots we've been working with are great at telling us what feels wrong, but they can't always articulate why in technical terms." The job offer had been tempting: better pay than flight instruction, cutting-edge technology, and a chance to stay connected to military aviation even if she couldn't serve directly. But it was what Marcus told her about the project that had really captured her attention. "We're not just building better flight sims," he'd explained, lowering his voice and glancing around the crowded coffee shop. "We're developing something called the Integrated Threat Assessment System. It's designed to test pilot responses to scenarios that are too dangerous or too classified to replicate in real training exercises." Laura had leaned forward, intrigued despite herself. What kind of scenarios? Asymmetric warfare, stealth incursions, multiple simultaneous threats from non-state actors, the kind of stuff that keeps Pentagon planners awake at night. Marcus had paused, studying her face carefully. The kind of stuff that requires pilots who can think beyond traditional doctrine and adapt to situations that aren't in any manual. The irony hadn't been lost on Laura. The same adaptability and creative thinking that Blackwood had dismissed as a lack of aggressiveness was exactly what the Pentagon's top strategists were now prioritizing in their most advanced training programs. She'd taken the job, officially working as a technical consultant on simulator development. Unofficially, she'd become something much more valuable: a test pilot for scenarios that push the boundaries of conventional military thinking. The work was conducted at a nondescript facility in the high desert, 90 minutes east of Los Angeles. The building looked like any other contractor's office from the outside, but inside was a technological marvel that would have made NASA jealous. The main simulation chamber contained a full-motion cockpit replica that could perfectly mimic the flight characteristics of any military aircraft in the U.S. inventory. Surrounded by 360-degree high-resolution displays that created completely immersive virtual environments. Laura's official job description said she was responsible for calibrating flight dynamics algorithms, but her real work was much more interesting. 3 times a week, she'd climb into the simulator and face scenarios that ranged from plausible to nightmarish. Enemy aircraft with capabilities that didn't match any known threats. Coordinated attacks on multiple fronts simultaneously. Electronic warfare environments were so sophisticated that traditional navigation and communication systems became completely unreliable. The scenarios were classified, but Marcus had explained the general concept during one of their late-night calibration sessions. Military intelligence agencies were increasingly concerned about potential adversaries who might combine advanced technology with unconventional tactics. Traditional pilot training focused on symmetric warfare, fighting enemies who used similar equipment and followed similar doctrines. But future conflicts might involve adversaries who played by completely different rules. Imagine facing an enemy who's using artificial intelligence to coordinate attacks faster than human pilots can respond. Or dealing with opponents who can jam your communications and GPS navigation while simultaneously spoofing your radar signatures. How do you fight an enemy you can't see, can't talk to your wingman about, and can't call for backup against? Those were the questions Laura found herself answering every time she strapped into the simulator. And the disturbing truth was that traditional military doctrine often fell apart completely when faced with such scenarios. Pilots trained to follow established procedures and maintain radio discipline found themselves helpless when the procedures didn't apply and radio discipline became impossible. But Laura's careful, methodical approach, the same qualities that Blackwood had criticized, proved surprisingly effective in these chaotic environments. When traditional navigation failed, she developed techniques for dead reckoning using visual landmarks and astronomical references. When communications were jammed, she'd learned to coordinate with wingmen using subtle changes in flight patterns that looked random to outside observers but conveyed tactical information to anyone who knew the code. Those were the questions Laura found herself answering every time she strapped into the simulator. And the disturbing truth was that traditional military doctrine often fell apart completely when faced with such scenarios. Pilots trained to follow established procedures and maintain radio discipline found themselves helpless when the procedures didn't apply and radio discipline became impossible. But Laura's careful, methodical approach, the same qualities that Blackwood had criticized, proved surprisingly effective in these chaotic environments. When traditional navigation failed, she developed techniques for dead reckoning using visual landmarks and astronomical references. When communications were jammed, she'd learned to coordinate with wingmen using subtle changes in flight patterns that looked random to outside observers but conveyed tactical information to anyone who knew the code. Most importantly, she discovered that her engineering background gave her a unique advantage when facing technologically sophisticated opponents. While other pilots saw electronic warfare as an incomprehensible black box, Laura understood the underlying physics well enough to develop countermeasures on the fly. The simulation work was intellectually challenging in ways that her military training had never been, but it was also emotionally exhausting. Every session was a reminder of what she'd lost, what she might have contributed to her country's defense if narrow-minded administrators hadn't decided she didn't fit their stereotype of a warrior. Laura found an outlet for those frustrations in an unlikely place: underground racing circuits that operated in the gray areas between legal and illegal aviation. These weren't the sanctioned air races that drew crowds and media attention. These were invitation-only events organized by pilots who valued skill over credentials, speed over safety margins, and innovation over regulations. The races typically took place in remote areas of Nevada or Arizona, using dry lake beds or abandoned airstrips as impromptu courses. Participants flew everything from modified aerobatic aircraft to experimental home-builts that pushed the boundaries of what was possible with civilian aviation technology. The only rules were informal ones: no interference with commercial air traffic, no flying over populated areas, and no talking to reporters or federal authorities. Laura had stumbled into this world through Jake Morrison, a former Navy pilot who'd been discharged for reasons that were never clearly explained but apparently involved personality conflicts with superior officers. Jake worked as a corporate pilot for a tech billionaire who collected vintage warbirds, and he'd recruited Laura to help with some technical consulting work on a restored P-51 Mustang. "You know," Jake had said one evening as they worked on recalibrating the Mustang's engine management system, "there are people who'd pay serious money to fly against someone with your skills in a real aircraft instead of a simulator." Laura had laughed, assuming he was joking. "I'm pretty sure my insurance company would have something to say about that." "I'm not talking about anything that shows up on insurance forms," Jake had replied with a grin that suggested he was only half kidding. "I'm talking about pilots who understand that the best way to improve your skills is to fly against people who are better than you are." The first race had been a revelation. Flying a borrowed Extra 300, a high-performance aerobatic aircraft that could pull 9 Gs and climb at nearly 3,000 feet per minute, Laura had found herself competing against pilots whose resumes read like a who's who of military and civilian aviation. Former Thunderbirds and Blue Angels pilots, test pilots from major aerospace companies, aerobatic champions whose names were legendary in aviation circles. She'd finished third in her first race, second in her second, and won her third. More importantly, she'd discovered that the unconventional tactics she'd developed in the simulator translated remarkably well to real-world flying. While other pilots relied on raw speed or traditional dogfighting maneuvers, Laura used unpredictable flight paths, sudden altitude changes, and creative interpretations of the course boundaries that technically followed the rules while completely confounding her opponents. The racing community was small enough that word traveled quickly about the new pilot who flew like she was solving a physics problem in real time. Laura found herself receiving invitations to increasingly exclusive events, flying increasingly exotic aircraft, competing against increasingly skilled opponents. But it was during a race in the Mojave Desert that she encountered something that would change everything. The event was more sophisticated than usual, a 3-day competition featuring multiple classes of aircraft and prize money substantial enough to attract international participants. Laura was flying a modified L-39 Albatross, a former Eastern Bloc military trainer that had been extensively upgraded with modern avionics and a more powerful engine. She was leading the final race of the weekend when she noticed something odd on her radar display. The contacts appeared suddenly, moving too fast to be civilian aircraft, and following flight paths that didn't match any commercial or military traffic she recognized. More disturbing, they seemed to be converging on the race area from multiple directions. Laura's first thought was that they were dealing with an unannounced military exercise. The Mojave was full of restricted airspace and test ranges, and it wouldn't be the first time civilian aviation had accidentally wandered into classified activities. She was about to abort the race and clear the area when her radio crackled to life with a transmission that chilled her blood. The voice was speaking accented English, but the content was unmistakably hostile. Commands to land immediately or face the consequences. References to American territorial violations and international incident protocols. Most disturbing of all, mentions of defensive measures that would be implemented if the incursion continued. For a moment, Laura thought it might be an elaborate prank or some kind of military training exercise that had gotten out of hand. But the radar contacts were moving with purpose and precision that suggested real intent, and the radio transmissions had an edge of genuine authority that was difficult to fake. She made a decision that would have gotten her court-martialed if she'd still been in the military, but seemed perfectly logical under the circumstances. Instead of immediately fleeing the area as the hostile aircraft demanded, she began observing their flight patterns, noting their apparent capabilities, memorizing every detail she could gather about their tactics and technology. What she saw was deeply troubling. The unknown aircraft displayed flight characteristics that didn't match any foreign military equipment in her knowledge base.
They moved with the coordination of a sophisticated air defense network, but their tactics suggested they were operating independently of any national command structure she recognized. Most importantly, they seemed to be testing American responses to airspace violations, probing reaction times, mapping radar coverage, evaluating the effectiveness of official channels for dealing with unauthorized incursions. Laura spent nearly 20 minutes observing the unknown aircraft from a distance, using the L-39's relatively small radar signal to avoid detection while gathering intelligence that would have been valuable to any number of government agencies. By the time she finally departed the area, she had a clear picture of what appeared to be a reconnaissance operation by unknown actors, using equipment that shouldn't have existed and tactics that suggested intimate knowledge of American air defense procedures. The question that haunted her during the drive home was simple. What should she do with information that could be crucial to national security, but had been gathered by someone who was no longer trusted to serve her country in uniform? The answer, she realized, was to ensure she was ready for whatever came next. Because if unknown actors were probing American airspace with advanced aircraft and sophisticated tactics, it was only a matter of time before someone with the authority to act would need pilots who could think beyond conventional doctrine and adapt to threats that aren't in any manual. Laura had no way of knowing that her preparation time was running out faster than she could imagine. But somewhere in the corridors of the Pentagon, analysts were beginning to connect dots that painted a picture of an emerging threat unlike anything America had faced before. And when that threat finally revealed itself, the same qualities that had gotten her dismissed from Ridgemont Naval Aviation Academy would make her the most valuable pilot in the country. The encrypted flash drive arrived at Laura's apartment on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who waited just enough to confirm her identity before disappearing into Los Angeles traffic. There was no return address, no explanation, just a small device that contained files that would make her question everything she thought she knew about the current state of global aviation security. Laura stared at the drive for nearly an hour before deciding to plug it into her laptop. The contents were extensive: satellite imagery, flight path analyses, technical specifications for aircraft that didn't appear in any public database, and most disturbing of all, intelligence reports suggesting that the mysterious contacts she'd observed in the Mojave were part of a much larger pattern. A handwritten note, tucked between the digital files, contained just 4 words: "You were right, help us." It was signed with initials she recognized: P.H., Patricia Hayes, her former flight instructor from Ridgemont, the woman who'd written in Laura's evaluation that she demonstrated exceptional composure under pressure and sound decision-making skills.
Laura's hands trembled slightly as she opened the first file. What she found was a comprehensive intelligence assessment that painted a picture of coordinated airspace violations across multiple regions, involving aircraft with capabilities that shouldn't have existed and operating under the command of organizations that intelligence agencies couldn't identify. The pattern had started 18 months earlier with isolated incidents that were easily dismissed as equipment malfunctions or misidentified civilian aircraft. A radar contact moving at impossible speeds near Alaskan air defense installations, unscheduled aircraft appearing in restricted airspace over Nevada test sites only to vanish before interceptors could investigate, electronic interference affecting military communication systems during routine training exercises. But the incidents had escalated in both frequency and sophistication. The intelligence files documented encounters involving multiple aircraft operating in coordination using electronic warfare capabilities that jammed conventional radar and communications while employing flight patterns that suggested intimate knowledge of American air defense procedures. Most disturbing were the technical analyses of the few physical encounters that had occurred. Fighter pilots who'd managed to intercept the unknown aircraft reported flight characteristics that defied conventional understanding of aerodynamics, acceleration rates that would have killed human pilots, maneuverability that seemed to ignore the laws of physics, and most troubling of all, complete immunity to electronic countermeasures that should have been effective against any known aircraft. Laura found herself reading late into the night, cross-referencing the intelligence reports with her own observations from the desert race. The aircraft she'd encountered matched several of the described characteristics, but more importantly, the tactics they'd employed, the coordinated reconnaissance patterns, the systematic probing of response times, the careful avoidance of actions that would trigger a major military response, suggested a level of strategic planning that went far beyond random airspace violations. Someone was conducting a comprehensive assessment of American air defense capabilities using technology that conventional military doctrine wasn't prepared to counter. The final file on the drive contained a secure communication protocol and instructions for a meeting that would take place in 3 days at a location Laura recognized, the high desert facility where she'd been working on simulation development. The message was brief but urgent. We need people who can think beyond conventional limitations. Your country needs you, whether they know it or not. Laura spent the next 48 hours in a state of controlled anxiety, continuing her normal routine while processing the implications of what she'd learned. She taught her regular flight students at Riverside Municipal, maintained the pretense of being a civilian instructor with no connection to military activities, and avoided any behavior that might suggest she was aware of classified information. But privately, she began making preparations that would have seemed paranoid to anyone who didn't understand the scope of the emerging threat. Her apartment became a study center for advanced aerial combat tactics, filled with technical manuals she'd acquired through aerospace industry contacts and theoretical papers on unconventional warfare that she downloaded from academic databases. She spent hours analyzing the flight characteristics described in the intelligence reports, developing mathematical models for aircraft performance that pushed the boundaries of known engineering principles. More practically, she began preparing for the possibility that her civilian aviation career might be interrupted by more pressing national security concerns. She updated her will, arranged for Miguel's continued education expenses to be handled through an educational trust, and had a difficult conversation with her mother about the possibility that she might need to disappear for an extended period without explanation. "Mija," Carmen had said during that conversation, her weathered hands holding a cup of coffee that had grown cold while they talked, "your father used to have dreams sometimes, bad dreams about threats that the military wasn't prepared for. He never told me details, but he would wake up in the middle of the night talking about enemies who fought in ways that weren't in any manual." Laura had looked at her mother with new understanding. "Why didn't you ever tell me about those dreams?" "Because I hoped they would stay dreams," Carmen had replied. "But if they're becoming real, then I'm glad it's someone like you who might be able to stop them." The meeting took place in a conference room that Laura had never seen before, located in a basement level of the simulation facility that required special clearance to access. When she arrived, she found herself facing a group of people who represented a cross-section of military and intelligence organizations that normally didn't work together. Patricia Hayes was there, now wearing the uniform of a Navy commander rather than the lieutenant commander rank Laura remembered. Beside her sat a man introduced as Colonel David Morrison, not Jake Morrison from the racing circuits, but someone who shared the same careful eyes that suggested special operations background. Also present were representatives from the Defense Intelligence Agency, the National Security Agency, and an organization that wasn't identified, but whose members carried credentials that commanded immediate respect from everyone else in the room. "Ms. Martinez," Commander Hayes began, "what we're about to discuss is classified at levels that don't have public names. Your presence here indicates that we believe you possess unique qualifications for dealing with an emerging threat to national security. However, your participation is entirely voluntary. You can walk away now with no consequences and no further contact from any of us." Laura looked around the room, studying faces that reflected the gravity of whatever was about to be revealed. "Before I decide, I need to know one thing. Are we talking about the aircraft I observed in the Mojave Desert 3 weeks ago?" Hayes and Morrison exchanged glances that confirmed Laura's suspicions. "Among other incidents," Morrison said carefully. "What can you tell us about that encounter?" For the next 20 minutes, Laura provided a detailed tactical analysis of everything she'd observed. Flight patterns, apparent performance characteristics, communication protocols, coordination between multiple aircraft, and her assessment of their likely mission objectives.
She described how the unknown aircraft had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded any known military technology, while employing tactics that suggested extensive knowledge of American air defense procedures. When she finished, the room was silent for several moments before the unidentified agency representative spoke for the first time. Ms. Martinez, in your professional opinion, could conventional military pilots successfully engage these aircraft using current doctrine and equipment? Laura considered the question carefully before answering. Not effectively. The performance advantages are too significant, and the conventional tactics are too predictable. Any engagement would need to rely on unconventional approaches that exploit the unknown capabilities' potential limitations rather than trying to match their advantages. Which brings us to why you're here, Hayes said. We need pilots who can develop and implement those unconventional approaches, pilots who can think beyond established doctrine and adapt to threats that aren't in any manual. Morrison leaned forward in his chair. We're not talking about a traditional military assignment, Ms. Martinez. This would be a civilian contractor position with a defense organization that operates in the spaces between conventional military branches. You'd have access to aircraft and technology that are still classified, working with a team of specialists who share your background of being too innovative for traditional military bureaucracy. The irony wasn't lost on Laura that the same qualities that had gotten her discharged from Ridgemont were now being described as essential qualifications for defending the country. What kind of timeline are we looking at?
The threat is escalating faster than our conventional forces can adapt, the NSA representative said. Intelligence suggests we may be facing direct confrontation within the next few months. We need people who can be ready to respond immediately when that happens. Laura thought about her father's dreams, her mother's understanding, acceptance, and the 3 years she'd spent believing her military career was over before it had really begun. She thought about the mysterious aircraft she'd encountered in the desert and the coordination they'd displayed that suggested much larger forces were already deploying against American interests. Most of all, she thought about Colonel Blackwood's assessment that she lacked the aggressive leadership necessary for combat operations. She wondered what he would think if he knew that aggressive leadership might be exactly the wrong approach for the kind of warfare America was about to face. "When do I start?" she asked. Hayes smiled for the first time since the meeting had begun. "You already have. Your simulation work over the past 6 months has been part of our preparation process. We've been developing tactics and training protocols based on the scenarios you've been testing. Now we need to move from simulation to reality." Morris's stood and moved to a wall-mounted display that showed a map of the southwestern United States marked with dozens of red indicators. These represent confirmed sightings of unknown aircraft over the past 6 weeks. The pattern suggests they're conducting final reconnaissance before initiating whatever operation they're planning. He pointed to a cluster of indicators near the California-Nevada border. "This is where we believe the first major confrontation will occur. There's a joint training exercise scheduled to begin in 2 weeks, involving Air Force, Navy, and Marine aviation units. It would be an ideal target for demonstrating the ineffectiveness of conventional American air power." Laura studied the map, noting the proximity to areas she knew well from her racing activities and simulation work. "You think they're going to attack a training exercise?" "We think they're going to turn a training exercise into a demonstration of American vulnerability," the unidentified representative said. "Unless we can demonstrate that we are not as vulnerable as they believe." Hayes placed a folder on the table in front of Laura. "Your assignment, should you choose to accept it, is to prepare for the possibility that you might be the only pilot capable of effectively engaging these aircraft when they reveal themselves. You'd be flying experimental aircraft, using tactics that have never been tested in combat, against opponents whose capabilities we don't fully understand." Laura opened the folder and found herself looking at technical specifications for aircraft that looked like they belonged in science fiction rather than military aviation. Propulsion systems that defied conventional engineering, flight control systems that incorporated artificial intelligence, weapon systems that were designed to counter threats that weren't supposed to exist. "How long do I have to prepare?" she asked. 10 days. Morrison replied. Then we find out whether unconventional thinking can overcome technological superiority. Laura closed the folder and looked around the room one final time. These people were offering her everything she'd ever wanted. The chance to serve her country, to fly the most advanced aircraft ever built, to prove that her approach to aviation was not only valid but essential. They were also offering her the opportunity to face threats that might be beyond any pilot's ability to handle, using experimental technology against opponents who had already demonstrated superiority over conventional forces. It was, she realized, exactly the kind of impossible situation her father had dreamed about and her training had prepared her for, even if that training had come from sources that Colonel Blackwood would never have approved. "I'll need access to everything," she said. "All the intelligence, all the technical data, all the simulation time I can get. And I'll need to know who my backup is, because if this goes wrong, someone else needs to be ready to continue the mission." Hayes nodded approvingly. "Already arranged. You'll be working with a team of pilots who share your background of being too unconventional for traditional military service. People who understand that the next war won't be won by following the last war's playbook." As Laura left the facility that evening, she realized that her real military career was finally about to begin. It had just taken 3 years and a near-catastrophic national security crisis for anyone to recognize that fact. The experimental aircraft designated X-47C Phantom looked nothing like any fighter jet Laura had ever seen. Sitting in the underground hangar at Groom Lake, it resembled a fusion of stealth technology and science fiction, with angular surfaces that seemed to absorb light and engines that hummed with a frequency that made her teeth ache. The cockpit was more computer terminal than traditional flight deck, dominated by holographic displays and neural interface connections that would allow the pilot to control the aircraft through thought as much as physical input. "She's responsive to pilots who think in 3 dimensions," explained Dr. Sarah Kim, the chief engineer who'd spent the last 5 years developing the Phantom's unique flight systems. "Traditional pilots try to impose their will on the aircraft. This one requires partnership. You think, she responds. You adapt, she adapts with you." Laura ran her hands along the aircraft's skin, feeling surfaces that were simultaneously familiar and alien. The engineering was revolutionary, incorporating propulsion systems that could switch between conventional turbine power and something that the technical manuals described only as field manipulation drives. She understood enough of physics to know that such technology should have been decades away from practical application. "How many of these exist?" she asked. 3, Dr. Kim replied, "and you're the only pilot who's successfully interfaced with the neural control systems without experiencing cognitive rejection syndrome." The past 10 days had been the most intensive training period of Laura's life. 8 hours daily in advanced simulators that made her previous work look primitive, followed by psychological conditioning to prepare her mind for the neural interface, followed by briefings on threats that were classified at levels she'd never known existed. The enemy aircraft, intelligence had finally determined, were not from any terrestrial nation. The technology was too advanced, the tactics too alien, and the strategic objectives too incomprehensible for human adversaries. Whether they represented extraterrestrial visitors, time travelers, or interdimensional intruders was still being debated by analysts who'd never expected to write reports containing such possibilities. What was clear was their intent: systematic degradation of Earth's military capabilities through demonstration of technological superiority, followed by unknown objectives that intelligence agencies were afraid to speculate about publicly. The joint training exercise at Nellis Air Force Base was scheduled to begin in 6 hours. Operation Desert Thunder would involve over 200 aircraft from multiple services, conducting coordinated maneuvers across several thousand square miles of Nevada airspace. It represented the largest concentration of American military aviation assets in a single location since the Gulf War, making it an irresistible target for any force seeking to demonstrate the inadequacy of conventional defense capabilities. Laura climbed into the Phantom's cockpit and initiated the startup sequence, feeling the aircraft systems synchronize with her neural patterns through electrodes attached to her temples. The sensation was indescribable, like gaining additional senses she'd never known she was missing. She could feel the aircraft's structural integrity, sense the electromagnetic environment around her, perceive gravitational fields and air pressure variations with an accuracy that was almost telepathic. "Phantom 1, you are cleared for launch," came the voice of Commander Hayes over the encrypted communication system. "Your mission parameters are simple. Observe the training exercise, identify threats as they emerge, and engage only if conventional forces prove inadequate." Laura guided the Phantom through the underground launch system, feeling the aircraft respond to her thoughts as much as her control inputs. The neural interface was disorienting at first, like learning to use muscles she'd never known existed. But within minutes, she began to understand why conventional pilots had failed to adapt. The system required abandoning traditional concepts of pilot and aircraft as separate entities. Instead, she had to think of herself as part of a larger organism, with the Phantom serving as an extension of her own consciousness. The aircraft emerged from its underground hangar into the pre-dawn darkness of the Nevada desert, rising silently on propulsion systems that left no heat signature and generated no electromagnetic emissions detectable by conventional sensors. Laura felt the Phantom's stealth systems activate automatically, rendering the aircraft invisible to radar, infrared detection, and visual observation from more than a few hundred yards away. She set course for Nellis Air Force Base, where the training exercise was already beginning. 200 miles away, pilots were conducting pre-flight briefings for what they believed would be a routine simulation of large-scale combat operations. None of them knew that their exercise had been compromised weeks earlier, that unknown intelligence services had access to their flight plans and tactical protocols, or that they were about to face threats that weren't included in any enemy capabilities assessment. Laura arrived at the exercise area just as the first wave of participating aircraft was taking off. F-22 Raptors, F-35 Lightning IIs, F-A-18 Super Hornets, and supporting aircraft spread across the morning sky in formations that represented decades of tactical doctrine and hundreds of billions of dollars in technological development. It was an impressive display of American air power, and, under normal circumstances, it would have been capable of dominating any conventional opponent. But the circumstances were far from normal. The first sign of trouble came 40 minutes into the exercise, when radar operators at Nellis began reporting contacts that shouldn't have existed. Aircraft appeared suddenly on screens without approaching from any logical direction, moving at speeds that exceeded known performance parameters, operating in formations that suggested coordination between dozens of units without detectable communications. Laura watched from 30,000 feet as the unknown aircraft emerged from what appeared to be empty sky. They were smaller than she'd expected based on intelligence reports, roughly the size of fighter jets but moving with fluid grace that defied conventional aerodynamics. More importantly, they were present in numbers that intelligence estimates had grossly underestimated. "All stations, this is Nellis Control," came the increasingly frantic voice of the exercise coordinator. "We have multiple unknown contacts entering the training area. All participating aircraft are directed to establish defensive positions and await further instructions." The response was immediate and professional. American pilots broke from their training scenarios and began implementing standard intercept procedures, forming defensive screens around high-value assets and moving to engage the unknown contacts according to established doctrine. It was exactly the wrong response. The unknown aircraft moved through the American formations like schools of fish navigating around obstacles.
When F-22s attempted to engage them with beyond visual range missiles, the weapons simply missed targets that seemed to anticipate their approach and adjust course before the missiles could acquire lock. When F-35s tried to use their advanced sensors to track the intruders, their electronics failed in cascading patterns that suggested sophisticated jamming beyond anything in human capability. Most disturbingly, the unknown aircraft demonstrated flight characteristics that seemed to ignore the laws of physics. They could stop virtually instantaneously, reverse direction without apparent deceleration, and perform maneuvers that would have subjected human pilots to lethal G-forces. Within 20 minutes, the exercise had transformed from routine training into a one-sided demonstration of technological superiority. American aircraft found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and completely outclassed by opponents who seemed to treat the engagement as a casual proving ground for capabilities the United States couldn't match. Laura watched F-22 pilots, the best-trained aviators in the world, flying the most advanced conventional fighters ever built, attempting to engage targets that danced around their attacks like children avoiding playground bullies. She saw F-35s losing formation cohesion as their electronics failed, pilots reverting to backup instruments that were inadequate for the high-speed, high-altitude environment they were operating in. "Phantom 1, you are cleared to engage," came Commander Hayes' voice over the encrypted channel. "Repeat, you are cleared to engage hostile targets." Laura felt the Phantom respond to her decision before she'd consciously made it, the aircraft systems automatically optimizing for combat configuration. The neural interface provided her with targeting information that seemed to flow directly into her consciousness: range, bearing, velocity, and predicted flight paths for dozens of enemy aircraft simultaneously. But more importantly, the interface gave her insight into the enemy's tactical patterns. She could see that their apparent randomness was actually sophisticated coordination, that their seemingly impossible maneuvers followed principles of physics that were advanced but not incomprehensible, and that their technology, while superior, operated within limitations that could be exploited by someone who understood the underlying principles. Laura dived toward the engagement zone, feeling the Phantom's field manipulation drives engage as she exceeded speeds that would have been impossible with conventional propulsion. The sensation was like riding lightning, with forces that should have crushed her being somehow redirected by the aircraft's internal systems. Her first target was an enemy aircraft that was systematically dismantling a formation of F/A-18 Super Hornets. The unknown craft moved with predatory precision, disabling one American fighter after another without destroying them, a psychological warfare tactic designed to demonstrate dominance rather than eliminate opposition. Laura approached from an angle that conventional tactics would have considered impossible, using the Phantom's field drives to generate thrust vectors that allowed her to attack from directions that the enemy aircraft's sensors weren't monitoring. The neural interface let her anticipate the target's evasive maneuvers, adjusting her approach in real time to account for flight patterns that seemed random but followed predictable mathematical principles. Her first shot was a directed energy weapon that existed nowhere in public military inventories, firing a concentrated beam that disrupted the enemy aircraft's propulsion systems without causing a catastrophic explosion. The unknown craft tumbled from the sky in a controlled descent that suggested its pilot was still alive but no longer capable of participating in combat. The effect on the enemy formation was immediate and dramatic. For the first time since the engagement began, the unknown aircraft seemed surprised, breaking from their coordinated attack patterns to investigate this new threat that had appeared without warning. Laura used their confusion to engage a second target, then a third, employing tactics that combined her understanding of advanced physics with maneuvers that no human pilot should have been capable of surviving. The Phantom's neural interface allowed her to execute flight patterns that would have overwhelmed conventional human reflexes, while the field manipulation drives enabled accelerations and direction changes that turned the aircraft into something closer to a projectile than a traditional fighter. But the enemy adapted quickly. After losing 4 aircraft to Laura's attacks, they began coordinating their responses specifically to counter her tactics. They moved in patterns designed to force her into engagement envelopes where their technological advantages would be decisive, using their superior numbers to create situations where she couldn't avoid taking fire from multiple directions simultaneously. Laura found herself flying the most demanding mission of her life, pushing both herself and the Phantom beyond design limitations while fighting opponents who seemed to learn from every engagement. The neural interface provided her with capabilities that no conventional pilot could have utilized, but it also demanded a level of mental integration that pushed her consciousness to its absolute limits. The battle raged across hundreds of square miles of Nevada airspace, with Laura serving as the only effective counter to an enemy force that was systematically dismantling American air power. Below her, conventional fighters continued their attempts to engage, but their weapons remained ineffective, and their electronics continued to fail under enemy jamming that seemed to target specific frequencies and protocols.
Phantom 1. Additional hostiles inbound from multiple vectors, Commander Hayes reported. Intelligence estimates you're facing 40-plus aircraft, with more arriving every minute. Laura checked her weapon status and felt a chill of recognition. She was running low on ammunition for the directed energy systems. The Phantom's experimental shields were beginning to fail under repeated enemy fire, and her neural interface was showing signs of cognitive overload that suggested she was approaching the limits of human consciousness. She was the most advanced pilot flying the most advanced aircraft in human history, and she was losing. The realization came with a moment of clarity that cut through the chaos of high-speed combat. She wasn't just fighting for the success of a training exercise or even for the integrity of American airspace. She was fighting for the future of human independence in a universe that apparently contained intelligences capable of treating Earth's most advanced military technology like children's toys. And in that moment, Laura Martinez understood that everything in her life, her father's dreams, her mother's sacrifices, her discharge from Ridgemont, her years of preparation in simulators and underground racing circuits had been leading to this single engagement above the Nevada desert. The sky erupted with energy discharges as unknown aircraft closed in from all directions, their coordinated attack patterns designed to overwhelm even the Phantom's advanced capabilities. Laura felt the neural interface surge with data as the aircraft's artificial intelligence systems reached out to her consciousness, offering capabilities that no human pilot had ever accessed. The question wasn't whether she could win the engagement. The question was whether she was willing to become something more than human in order to save humanity itself. The transformation began at the moment Laura stopped thinking of herself as a pilot controlling an aircraft and started thinking of herself as a consciousness inhabiting a larger technological organism. The neural interface, which had been providing her with enhanced awareness and faster reaction times, suddenly deepened into something that felt like cellular-level integration with the Phantom systems. She could feel the aircraft's structural stress patterns like muscles in her own body, sense electromagnetic fields the way she might feel temperature changes, and perceive gravitational variations with the same clarity as balance. More importantly, she could access computational resources that allowed her to process multiple simultaneous engagements with a speed and accuracy that transcended normal human limitations. The enemy aircraft that had been closing in for what appeared to be a decisive attack suddenly found themselves facing an opponent who no longer moved according to predictable human patterns. Laura's flight path became a three-dimensional equation that incorporated variables the enemy's tactical algorithms hadn't been programmed to account for: intuition, creativity, and the kind of adaptive intelligence that could only emerge from the intersection of human consciousness and advanced artificial intelligence. Her next series of attacks eliminated 6 enemy aircraft in rapid succession, using targeting solutions that combined the Phantom's computational power with tactical insights that no computer could have generated independently. She wasn't just outflying the enemy anymore. She was outthinking them in ways that suggested the emergence of entirely new forms of consciousness. 30,000 feet below, the conventional battle continued with very different results. American pilots who had been helplessly outclassed minutes earlier were reporting that enemy jamming had suddenly become less effective, that their targeting systems were beginning to reacquire locks, and that the enemy formation was showing signs of confusion and disorganization. "What the hell is happening up there?" came the voice of Colonel Richard Stone, the exercise commander who had been watching his carefully planned training operation turn into a demonstration of American military inadequacy. "Nellis Control, I need a status report on whatever's engaging those unknown contacts." The response came not from Nellis Control, but from a communication channel that Colonel Stone had never heard before. The voice was calm, professional, and carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to operating at the highest levels of national security. "Colonel Stone, this is General Patricia Thornfield, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. The aircraft currently engaging hostile forces is operating under direct authorization from the Secretary of Defense. Your conventional forces are directed to maintain defensive positions and provide support as requested." Stone had never heard of General Thornfield, but the authentication codes that accompanied her transmission were valid at levels that made his security clearance look like a library card. More importantly, whatever was happening in the airspace above him was turning the tide of an engagement that had been heading towards complete disaster. "General, I need to know what kind of aircraft is capable of engaging these, whatever they are. My best pilots and our most advanced fighters can't even get a weapons lock." "The aircraft is experimental, Colonel. The pilot is someone you might find familiar, though I suspect you knew her under different circumstances." Before Stone could ask for clarification, his attention was drawn skyward by a series of explosions that painted the morning sky with trails of exotic energy. The unknown aircraft that had been systematically dismantling American air power were now retreating in formations that suggested panic rather than tactical withdrawal. High above, Laura was experiencing combat in ways that no human pilot had ever conceived. The neural interface had evolved from a tool that enhanced her capabilities into something that felt like a fundamental expansion of her consciousness. She could perceive the battlefield in its entirety, every aircraft, every missile, every electromagnetic emission, while simultaneously calculating tactical solutions that incorporated variables spanning multiple dimensions of space and time. The enemy's technology, which had seemed impossibly advanced when compared to conventional human capabilities, revealed itself to have limitations that became exploitable once you possessed the computational resources to analyze them in real time. Their propulsion systems operated according to principles that could be disrupted if you understood the underlying physics. Their coordination protocols relied on communication methods that could be jammed if you knew the right frequencies. Their tactical algorithms followed patterns that became predictable once you had sufficient processing power to identify the mathematical relationships. But more than that, Laura discovered that the enemy had made a fundamental miscalculation about human consciousness. Their technology was optimized for engaging biological intelligences operating within conventional cognitive parameters. They had no protocols for dealing with a consciousness that had been technologically augmented to operate beyond those parameters. She wasn't just fighting as an enhanced human pilot anymore. She was fighting as something unprecedented, a hybrid consciousness that combined human intuition and creativity with artificial intelligence processing power and exotic technology that pushed the boundaries of known physics. The results were devastating for the enemy formation. Aircraft that had seemed invulnerable to conventional weapons found themselves being systematically eliminated by attacks that came from impossible angles using tactics that violated every principle of aerial combat they had been programmed to expect. Phantom 1, you are achieving impossible results. Enemy forces are retreating from the engagement area. Conventional forces are reporting restored systems functionality across the board. Laura felt the truth of the statement through the neural interface. The enemy's retreat wasn't tactical, it was strategic. They were withdrawing not just from this engagement, but from this approach to Earth entirely. Her demonstration of capabilities they hadn't expected had forced them to recalculate the viability of their operation. But the neural interface also provided her with disturbing intelligence about the true scope of what they had been facing.
The aircraft she had engaged were only the advanced reconnaissance elements of a much larger force. The enemy's strategic plan had involved demonstrating human military inadequacy as a prelude to demands for surrender that would have been backed by overwhelming technological superiority.
Her success in this engagement had disrupted that plan, but it had also revealed to the enemy that human technology was more advanced than they had calculated. The next phase of contact, if it occurred, would involve very different assumptions about human capabilities. "All stations, this is General Thornfield," came the voice that had introduced itself to Colonel Stone. "The immediate threat has been neutralized. All participating aircraft are directed to return to base and await debriefing. Standard classification protocols are now in effect for all personnel involved in this engagement." As Laura guided the Phantom toward Nellis Air Force Base, she felt the neural interface beginning to disengage, returning her consciousness to something approximating normal human parameters. The experience left her with a profound understanding of what she had temporarily become, and an equally profound appreciation for the limitations of her normal human consciousness. The Phantom touched down on a runway that had been cleared of all personnel except those with clearances that existed at levels most military officers would never know about. As the aircraft's systems powered down, Laura realized that her life had irrevocably changed in ways that went far beyond career prospects or personal vindication. She climbed out of the cockpit to find herself facing a reception committee that included some of the most senior military and intelligence officials in the United States government. General Thornfield was there, along with representatives from organizations that didn't advertise their existence publicly. But what caught Laura's attention was the presence of Colonel James Blackwood, looking like a man who had just watched his entire worldview collapse in real time. "Lieutenant Martinez," General Thornfield said, using a rank that Laura had never officially held. "On behalf of the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense, I want to thank you for your service today. Your actions have quite literally preserved American independence and possibly human freedom itself." The words felt surreal after years of being told that she lacked the qualities necessary for military leadership. Laura looked around at faces that reflected a mixture of awe, gratitude, and barely concealed fear about the implications of what they had witnessed. "Ma'am," Laura replied, falling back on military courtesy that felt both natural and strange after her extended civilian status, "I was just doing what the situation required." What the situation required, interrupted a voice she recognized, was capabilities that no conventional pilot could have provided. Laura turned to see Colonel Blackwood approaching, his face reflecting emotions that she couldn't immediately identify. The man who had dismissed her from Ridgemont with contemptuous certainty now looked like someone grappling with fundamental questions about his own judgment and competence. "Colonel," Laura said simply, offering a crisp salute that was returned with mechanical precision. Blackwood studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I owe you an apology, Lieutenant. A profound apology. My assessment of your capabilities was not just incorrect, it was dangerously wrong. If I had succeeded in preventing your continued development as a pilot, today's outcome might have been very different." The admission was clearly difficult for him, but Laura could see that it came from genuine recognition rather than political necessity. "Sir, you were working with the information available at the time and applying standards that had been effective in conventional military contexts." "No," Blackwood said firmly. "I was applying prejudices that had nothing to do with military effectiveness and everything to do with my own limitations. You demonstrated leadership today in ways that I failed to recognize during your time at Ridgemont. More importantly, you demonstrated that the future of military aviation requires thinking that goes far beyond conventional doctrine." General Thornfield stepped forward, clearly wanting to move the conversation toward more pressing operational concerns.
Lieutenant Martinez, we need to discuss your future role in national security operations. Today's engagement has revealed capabilities that are going to be essential for defending against threats we're only beginning to understand. Laura looked around at the assembled officials, many of whom were studying her with expressions that suggested they were seeing her as something more than human. The neural interface experience had given her insights into capabilities that existed beyond normal human limitations, but it had also reinforced her appreciation for the qualities that made her specifically human. "General," she said carefully, "I need to understand what we're really talking about. Today's mission pushed both human consciousness and technology into areas that we don't fully understand. Before we discuss future operations, we need to have serious conversations about the implications of what we're developing." "Agreed," Thornfield replied. "But those conversations will need to take place in more secure facilities than this. For now, I need to know whether you're willing to continue serving in this capacity." Laura thought about her father's dreams of threats that conventional military doctrine couldn't handle. Her mother's understanding that sometimes service required sacrifices that couldn't be easily explained, and her own journey from a discharged cadet to someone who had just saved human independence through capabilities that existed at the intersection of consciousness and technology. "Yes, ma'am. I'm willing to serve." The response seemed to relieve tension that had been building among the assembled officials. Whatever they had planned for dealing with the implications of today's engagement, it required Laura's continued participation. "Excellent," Thornfield said. "Colonel Blackwood, I believe you have something else to say to Lieutenant Martinez." Blackwood nodded and moved to a position that was clearly formal rather than conversational. "Lieutenant Laura Martinez, by authority of the Secretary of the Navy and the Chief of Naval Operations, you are hereby reinstated to active duty with the rank of Lieutenant Commander, effective immediately. Your service record will reflect exemplary performance in operations critical to national security." He extended his hand, offering rank insignia that represented not just a restoration of her military career, but a recognition that her capabilities were essential for challenges that conventional military thinking couldn't address. As Laura accepted the insignia, she realized that her story had come full circle in ways that were both personally satisfying and strategically crucial. The same qualities that had gotten her dismissed from flight school were now being recognized as essential for the future of human defense against threats that required thinking beyond conventional limitations. But more than personal vindication, she understood that today's events had revealed the emergence of new forms of warfare that would require fundamentally different approaches to military service. The integration of human consciousness with advanced technology wasn't just a tactical innovation, it was an evolutionary step that carried implications for the future of human identity itself. 3 months after the engagement that intelligence analysts would later classify as humanity's first successful defense against extraterrestrial aggression, Lieutenant Commander Laura Martinez stood before a joint session of Congress in a hearing room that had been modified with security measures that didn't appear in any public building codes. The session was classified at levels that required members of Congress to undergo additional background checks just to attend, and the testimony being given would remain sealed for decades. But for Laura, the most meaningful moment wasn't occurring in the hearing room. It was happening in a secure viewing area where her mother, Carmen Martinez, sat alongside McGill, now a senior in high school and already accepted to the Air Force Academy on a full scholarship. Both wore visitor badges that granted them access to facilities where most world leaders would never be permitted.
"The operational success demonstrated in Nevada," Laura was saying to the assembled legislators, "represents more than just technological advancement or tactical innovation. It represents a fundamental shift in how we need to think about human potential and the intersection of consciousness with advanced systems. Senator Patricia Walsh, chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, leaned forward in her seat. Lieutenant Commander Martinez, help us understand the broader implications. Are we talking about creating enhanced human beings? Are we discussing the militarization of consciousness itself? Laura had anticipated this question during weeks of preparation for the hearing. The neural interface technology that had enabled her success against the extraterrestrial forces raised profound questions about the future of human identity, military service, and the boundaries between biological and artificial intelligence. Senator, what we've discovered is that human consciousness possesses capabilities that we've barely begun to explore. The neural interface doesn't create abilities that don't exist. It reveals and amplifies abilities that were always present but never properly developed or utilized. She gestured toward a holographic display that showed brain activity patterns recorded during her engagement with the enemy forces. Traditional pilot training focuses on conscious decision-making processes that operate at relatively slow speeds. But human consciousness includes intuitive and creative faculties that can process information and generate solutions at speeds approaching those of artificial intelligence systems. Congressman Michael Torres from California raised his hand. Are you saying that any pilot could have achieved the same results with the same technology? No, sir, Laura replied honestly. The neural interface requires specific psychological and cognitive characteristics that aren't common in the general population. Moreover, it requires years of preparation to develop the mental flexibility necessary to integrate human consciousness with artificial intelligence systems without experiencing cognitive rejection. What she didn't say, but what was detailed in classified appendices to her testimony, was that her specific background, the careful, methodical approach that Colonel Blackwood had dismissed as lack of aggressiveness, the engineering knowledge that provided her with intuitive understanding of complex systems, the years of simulation training that had prepared her mind for non-conventional flight dynamics had created a psychological profile uniquely suited for consciousness technology integration. The hearing continued for 6 hours, covering topics that ranged from the immediate military applications of neural interface technology to the long-term implications for human evolution. But for Laura, the most important conversation took place afterward, in a secure conference room where she finally had the opportunity to speak privately with her family. "Mija," Carmen said, her weathered hands holding Laura's with the same gentle strength that had sustained the family through years of struggle. "Your father would be so proud, not just of what you accomplished, but of who you've become." Miguel, now taller than both his mother and sister, looked at Laura with an expression that combined admiration with something that might have been concerning. "Laura, the news reports are calling you a hero, but they're not saying what you actually did. People are speculating about everything from secret weapons to alien encounters." Laura looked at her younger brother, seeing in his face the same curiosity and determination that had driven her own career in aviation. He would be starting at the Air Force Academy in 6 months, following a path that she had helped make possible, but that would lead to very different destinations than her own journey. "Miguel, what I can tell you is that the future of military service is going to require people who can think beyond conventional limitations, people who can adapt to threats that don't fit traditional patterns. People who understand that the greatest strength isn't always following established procedures. Sometimes it's knowing when to abandon those procedures entirely." She paused, considering how much she could safely reveal without violating classification restrictions. "The most important thing I learned isn't about technology or tactics. It's about the importance of staying true to your own capabilities, even when other people don't understand or value them." Carmen nodded approvingly. "That's what your father always said. He told me once that the military would eventually need people who can think like engineers and fight like poets. I never understood what he meant until now." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of General Thornfield, who had been overseeing the transition of the neural interface program from experimental status to operational deployment. Her expression suggested that she was bearing news that would significantly impact Laura's immediate future. "Lieutenant Commander," Thornfield said, "I have orders from the Secretary of Defense. You're being assigned to command the newly established Cognitive Aviation Warfare Division. Your mission will be to develop and train the next generation of neural interface pilots while continuing to serve as our primary response asset for unconventional aerial threats. Laura felt a moment of vertigo that had nothing to do with flight training. 6 months earlier, she had been a discharged naval aviation cadet with no clear career prospects. Now, she was being offered command of a division that would shape the future of human consciousness and military technology. General, I'm honored by the assignment, but I need to ask about the timeline for development. Are we expecting additional contact with the forces we encountered in Nevada? Thornfield's expression grew more serious. Intelligence indicates that our successful defense has bought us time, but it's also revealed our capabilities to potential adversaries. We estimate that we have 18 to 24 months to develop operational neural interface squadrons before facing threats that will require capabilities beyond what any single pilot can provide. The implication was clear. Laura's individual success had been crucial for immediate defense, but the future would require scaling her capabilities across multiple pilots and multiple aircraft. The challenge wasn't just technological, it was pedagogical, psychological, and philosophical. How do you teach someone to transcend the boundaries of individual consciousness? How do you prepare human minds for integration with artificial intelligence systems that operate beyond conventional cognitive parameters? I accept the assignment, Laura said, understanding that her real career was just beginning. But I'll need resources that go beyond traditional military training programs. We'll need psychologists, philosophers, engineers, and educators who understand that we're not just developing new pilots, we're exploring new forms of consciousness. Thornfield nodded. Already arranged. You'll have access to researchers from universities and institutions that don't appear in public directories, working with technologies that are decades ahead of anything in the public sector. As the meeting concluded, and Laura prepared to begin a career that would have been inconceivable just months earlier, she found herself thinking about the broader implications of her story. Her journey from discharged cadet to commander of humanity's most advanced aviation program wasn't just personal vindication. It was a demonstration of principles that extended far beyond military service. Later that evening, Laura stood on the observation deck of the secure facility at Groom Lake, looking up at stars that no longer seemed like distant points of light, but like neighboring territories in a universe that had revealed itself to be far more complex than previous generations had imagined. Her phone buzzed with a message from Jake Morrison, her friend from the underground racing circuits. Saw the news about some kind of military breakthrough in Nevada. Can't help but think you might have been involved. Proud of you, whatever you did. She smiled, realizing that her story had become something that extended beyond personal achievement or national security. Her success against technologically superior opponents demonstrated that human consciousness, properly developed and applied, could overcome advantages that seemed insurmountable. But more importantly, her journey has proven that qualities which appear to be weaknesses in one context can become essential strengths in another. The careful, methodical approach that Blackwood had dismissed as lack of aggressiveness had proven to be exactly what was needed for consciousness-technology integration. The engineering background that had seemed irrelevant to traditional pilot training had provided crucial insights for understanding advanced propulsion and weapon systems. The years of simulation training that had been dismissed as theoretical rather than practical had prepared her mind for flight dynamics that violated conventional understanding of physics.
Her story wasn't just about overcoming prejudice or proving doubters wrong. It was about the importance of developing your authentic capabilities even when those capabilities don't fit established categories or meet conventional expectations. The next morning, Laura began her new assignment by meeting with the first candidates for neuro-interface training. They were a diverse group of pilots who shared one crucial characteristic. All had been considered too unconventional for traditional military aviation roles. There was Captain Maria Santos, a former F-22 pilot who had been transferred to transport duty after questioning tactical doctrine that she believed was outdated for modern warfare. Lieutenant Robert Kim, a Navy aviator who had been denied carrier assignment because his innovative approaches to navigation and targeting were considered unreliable by conservative flight instructors.
Major Sarah Thompson, an Air Force pilot who had been passed over for promotion because her analytical approach to combat situations was deemed too academic for practical application. Each of them had stories that paralleled Laura's own experience with military bureaucracy that valued conformity over innovation. Each had been told, in various ways, that their capabilities didn't match the requirements for elite military aviation. Each had continued developing their skills despite official discouragement, driven by understanding that their unique approaches might someday prove valuable. The program we're beginning today, Laura told the assembled candidates during their first briefing, isn't just about learning to fly advanced aircraft or interface with artificial intelligence systems. It's about discovering capabilities within yourselves that you may not have known existed. She gestured toward the phantom aircraft visible through the hangar windows, sleek shapes that represented the intersection of human consciousness and technological possibility. Traditional pilot training teaches you to control aircraft through conscious decision-making and physical manipulation of controls. Neural interface piloting requires you to become part of the aircraft, to think and react at speeds that transcend normal human limitations, while maintaining the creativity and intuition that no artificial intelligence can replicate. Captain Santos raised her hand. "Ma'am, how do we prepare for that kind of integration without losing our individual identity?" "That's the most important question you can ask," Laura replied. "The neural interface doesn't erase who you are. It reveals who you are at levels you've never accessed before. But it requires you to be completely honest about your capabilities and limitations, to understand your own consciousness well enough to expand it without losing it." Over the following weeks, Laura developed training protocols that combined advanced psychology with cutting-edge neuroscience, meditation practices with high-speed flight training, philosophical exploration with tactical innovation. The goal wasn't just to create pilots who could operate neural interface aircraft, but to develop human beings who could serve as bridges between individual consciousness and collective technological capability. The work was challenging in ways that conventional military training had never prepared her for. Each candidate required individualized approaches that honored their unique psychological profiles while developing the mental flexibility necessary for consciousness technology integration. Some progressed rapidly, demonstrating natural aptitude for transcending conventional cognitive boundaries. Others struggled with concepts that challenged fundamental assumptions about individual identity and technological interaction. But gradually, a new kind of military unit emerged: pilots who could think and react at superhuman speeds while maintaining distinctly human creativity and moral judgment. Aviators who could interface with artificial intelligence systems without losing their individual perspectives and values. Warriors who could access technological capabilities that exceeded anything in human history while remaining committed to protecting human freedom and dignity. 6 months after beginning the training program, Laura received word that long-range sensors had detected approaching contacts that matched the signatures of the forces she had engaged over Nevada. But this time, the response would involve not just one experimental aircraft and one uniquely qualified pilot, but an entire squadron of neuro-interface aviators prepared to defend human independence against threats that conventional military doctrine couldn't address. As Laura prepared for what intelligence analysts believed would be humanity's second direct confrontation with extraterrestrial forces, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a discharged naval aviation cadet to the commander of humanity's most advanced defense capability. Her story had become something larger than personal vindication or career achievement. It had become a demonstration that human consciousness, properly developed and applied, could overcome any challenge, no matter how technologically advanced, no matter how strategically sophisticated, no matter how completely it exceeded conventional understanding of what was possible. The stars that had once seemed like distant decorations in an empty sky now represented a frontier where human consciousness would determine not just the future of military aviation, but the future of human independence in a universe that had revealed itself to be far more complex and dangerous than anyone had imagined.
But Laura Martinez, the daughter of a crew chief who had dreamed of impossible threats and impossible solutions, was ready for whatever came next, because she had learned the most important lesson of all. The greatest limitations aren't technological or tactical, they're psychological. And human consciousness, properly understood and courageously applied, has no limits at all. The sky had never been the beginning. It had always been the doorway to everything beyond.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.